Good morning. Looks like we are live. Welcome to a Monday morning edition of Coffee with Rich. My name is Rich Brown. I am the co-host and co-founder of the American Warrior Society and the American Warrior Show, which is America's #1 self-defense podcast. And this morning I'm going to be joined by Neil Taylor. Neil is a corporate attorney in South Africa, as well as a solicitor in the UK, and we'll discuss that. Good morning. My good friend Will Parker is already jumping on out there in the beautiful state of Montana. Will, I hope you're being blessed today, sir. As we're getting started, go ahead and please like and hit that share button. If you're joining us today in a podcast in the days and weeks to come, welcome. If you're watching this show on the Coffee with Rich YouTube channel, I'm happy to have you. Let's go ahead and talk about some sponsors, man. We got some amazing sponsors. The #1 sponsor of Coffee with Rich is the American Warrior Society. With the riots that we've seen here in America in 2020 and what's going on in South Africa and many countries around the world, including France, looks like it's joining the fray. You need somewhere to learn about self-defense. It's not always, it's a learned skill, let me put it that way. And the American Warrior Society has you covered. We got everything from less lethal, weapons retention, defensive rifle use, how to clear a structure, either one-man or two-man, room clearing. We've got everything from edged weapons, pepper spray, you name it, it's in the training vault. So please check out the American Warrior Society. First 14 days, don't cost you anything, folks. We also have sponsors like Century Martial Arts, makers of the Bob XL. If you can find a better striking opponent than Bob XL, I would like to know about it because I think it is absolutely fantastic. You can also use it as a 3D target to shoot at. And we also have the Cool Fire Trainer ammunition prices, not only in South Africa, but here in America are absolutely extremely high. Some say they're coming down, but it's still hard to find. But in the interim, I would encourage you to take your dry fire training to the next level with a Cool Fire Trainer. We also have Mountain Man Medical. Right now we have the co-branded American Warrior Society and Mountain Man Medical Trauma Kit. You can pick one up for basically at cost over there at Mountain Man Medical. Please see the links to all of our amazing sponsors in today's show notes, as well as links to some articles about what's going on in South Africa, as well as the Coffee with the Rich channel. We also have Precision Holsters, maker of the Ultra Appendix holster that I use, as well as the competition line that myself and Mike Seeklander use. Please check them out. They have amazing tactical belts as well. Last but not least is apphemp.com, which is Appalachian Standard, makers of CBD products that will really help your cognitive ability as well as your sleeping and joint recovery. Looks like we got Yako out there in South Africa. Good morning, Yako. Need to get you on the show, brother. Will is on from Missouri. Alan Kelly from occupied Virginia. Tony is on from Brunswick, Georgia. Walt East, good morning, sir. He said, good morning, folks. Currently in Jacksonville, Florida. Please like and hit that share button. Got an amazing show for you this morning. All right, we've paid the bills, Neil. We got the sponsor reads out of the way. Welcome back to Coffee with the Rich, sir.
Thank you so much, Rich. Great, glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to see you safe and sound, my friend. That is a good thing. I want to read Neil's bio. It's very, very brief, and we'll ask Neil to tell us what the bio overlooks. But Neil is a South African and British corporate attorney, hunter, and competitive shooter. And today on Coffee with Rich, we're going to discuss the recent riots in South Africa, gun laws, self-defense laws, as well as individual thoughts on security preparations, as well as some EDC things that are maybe a little bit different over there in South Africa. And Guile is on from the Philippines. Good morning, Guile. Happy to have you, sir. So, Neil, man, what does that bio overlook about you?
Rich, I'm like many of your podcast listeners and viewers, I'm a very keen, hunter, shooter, family man, and I believe very much in the right to own and possess firearms for lawful use by civilians. I'm not former military, I'm not former police. I'm just one of the regular guys that grew up in a household with guns and understands and believes very strongly in them.
Yeah, and your country in South Africa, you don't have something quite like the Second Amendment, do you?
No, we sadly don't. And I must say, there have been very many occasions over my adult life where I've envied the U.S. constitutionally enshrined right to own firearms. Our police service, who oversees the licensing of civilian firearms, is called the CPF. Is called the it's a division of the police, and they regard it as a privilege for civilians to own firearms, the CFR, Central Firearms Registry. So on every occasion, you as a civilian need to justify and explain why it is that you should be allowed to own a firearm, and then explain and justify what the purpose, the specified purpose will be.
Yeah, we talked about that yesterday in the pre-show. Gregory is on. Gregory, I got to get you on, man. I want you to talk about what's going on in Afghanistan. I know that you're close to some folks over there from your years of working there. So please hit me up, Gregory, if you're willing to come on the show, man. I'd love to have you, and welcome. Yeah, that the fact that you don't have a Second Amendment, you and I were talking about that yesterday. Like, you have to check on the form, what is the purpose for getting this firearm, whether it's collecting or sports shooting or whatever. Can you talk to a little bit more detail of that?
Yes. So the process in South Africa is rather arduous, and ironically, notwithstanding the current legislation being amongst the most stringent in the world, the authorities are trying to further curb private ownership of firearms. So the current lay of the land, I'll touch on first. Broadly, before you may obtain a firearm of any sort, you need to pass both a practical and a theoretical test, the one on the firearm laws, and the second on the practical application and utilization of the 4 different platforms of firearms. One being pistol, the other a bolt-action rifle, semi-auto rifle, and handguns, and shotguns. And once you've done that and passed the test, and it needs to be done through an accredited training institution, you lodge an application with the police, and it gets considered, and ultimately you get granted your competency. And if you want to buy, for instance, a shotgun, you need a competency for the platform shotguns, or a competency for the platform pistol, bolt-action rifle, and so on. Once you've passed that, you then approach a lawful, again, registered firearms dealer or a private individual that might be selling a weapon, and you obtain the necessary police forms and you fill them out. And that's not enough. You then need to submit as well a motivation, an explanation or justification why you're looking to buy, for instance, a pistol. And typically, there are restrictions for someone that is not an active participant in hunting or sport shooting. So occasional hunters and occasional sport shooters can own up to 4 weapons in total, one of which may be a handgun. If you're more committed and involved in different sports, you would typically need to belong to an organization like a registered, accredited hunting organization, sport shooting organization, or maybe even a collector organization. And if you then want to buy a weapon that's above the allotted maximum of 4, you need to approach them, and they need to endorse on technical grounds why it is that my wish to obtain a license for a pistol would work in this and this category of IPSC or IDPA. In the US, I think it's USPSA. And they, as an accredited organization, would certify and almost back up the fact that you want to buy this weapon. You then get your police forms that you've completed, your motivation and supporting documentation. In my case, I've lodged one, and it's 75 pages. So it's written like a legal document, 8 to 10 pages of motivation. Each comment or statement is backed up by a certificate, a completion, activities list, and so on. And then you submit that. And currently, the CFR is taking anywhere between 9 months and 12 months to process and approve your license application.
And if that sounds arduous, folks, it's because it is. It's absolutely, it's not a bug of the system. It's a feature. That's the way it's designed. And, the problem with that is, as we talked about on the previous time you were on the show, Neil, for someone like yourself as a corporate attorney, you write legal briefs every day. You can do it in your sleep. But for someone that is somewhat illiterate, living in a shanty town, it is absolutely a way to disenfranchise the poor, from my opinion.
Yeah, no, you're spot on, Rich. And I think the most worrying aspect of that is even a regular lay person, not even an indigent person, will probably not submit, that they won't be aware that if you say you're an active competitive sport shooter, that should be substantiated by a membership certificate of your association, by an activities printout of all the events you have participated in, by maybe certificates of additional training. If you don't do that, they can reject that application. And then the route is appeal. But the problem is, to have a more successful appeal, you should ideally reference documents that they've overlooked in your original submission. For me as a lawyer, everyone always says, why do you submit so many docs? I do it because the appeal will automatically be lost by the CFR. because there would be no basis or grounds for them to reject or refuse the application.
Guys, as you can tell, we are very fortunate here with the Second Amendment, and we have to do everything we can to keep it because folks are coming after it. That's all I can tell you. I'm not trying to stoke fear. I'm just telling you. Good morning, David Frazier, my good friend out there. Be careful, sir. Terry is on, says, good morning from a muggy Arab, Alabama. High today, expected to be around 105 degrees. Ooh. Yeah, thank you to the 13 folks that are joining us live. Please like and hit that share button. We are just getting started because we've talked a little bit about the how incredibly difficult it is to get firearms. But one of the things that you recently told me, or I believe it was you, Neil, was some issues regarding ammunition. I don't know if it's coming down the pike or it's already here with regard to limits on the amount of ammunition you can have. Is that correct?
Yes, Rich. So that forms part of a proposal by a legislature to, notwithstanding the arduous process to get licensed or accredited, they are looking to further restrict and in some cases totally cancel the civilians' rights to hold weapons for certain purposes. So the new proposal that we are trying to mobilize hunters and sports shooters and collectors and reloaders to object to is as follows. They, in broad brush terms, they're seeking to remove the category called Section 13, which is self-defense-led category for the possession of maybe a home defensive shotgun, typically pistols, revolvers, that sort of thing. They, notwithstanding our spiraling crime rate, would have us believe that it is not necessary for a civilian to own a weapon for self-defensive purposes. Now, that is the most preposterous thing, because if you even look at the police's own crime statistics, that argument is not defendable. If you look at international statistics or independent statistics, the crime rates are even higher than the police would have us believe, because the police don't record all crimes and they don't categorize it correctly. So I think that's preposterous. Tied to that, they would also want to do away with reloading. Now, many of your members, I've been a long time listener of your show, many of your members will know that as a sports shooter, and certainly, to a degree as a hunter, one would reload for those specific purposes. And they want to overnight, with the signing of this new bill, make it illegal for us to reload. So in order to keep costs down, as all of us do, we tend to reload, and you need to do it more so for sports shooting purposes, because we shoot hundreds and hundreds of rounds, if not thousands of rounds a month. So that would be illegal. The cost and value of components we have, of reloading equipment that we have, would automatically then be worthless overnight. And there's no talk about the government then compensating members and individuals for the loss of value. It's just, this is what they're proposing. They're also proposing to terminate any rights and entitlement for certified collectors under our laws. Now, a collector is a very difficult categorization that civilians, or there are a bunch of hoops that civilians need to jump through in order to be a certified firearm collector. Normally, you would need to join a collecting organization, again, that's accredited and registered with the CFR. Then you would need to develop a theme. And the theme might be something like weapons used in South Africa's border conflicts between, let's say, 1975 and 1990. And within that theme, any weapon you seek to acquire would need to meet the requirements of the theme. Now, the new member, and I'm not a collector, but I have friends who are collectors, any person who joins a collecting organization needs to be a member for 2 to 3 years before they're even eligible to purchase a weapon in their theme as a collector. And then they would have to apply to that collecting organization, remember, which is certified and recognized by the police, to say, I'm Neil Taylor, I've been a member for 3.5 years, I want to buy an old R1, a 7.62 FN style rifle, which falls into my theme, and I want it because I don't have one in my theme. So that's a very arduous process, and they need to attend a certain number of meetings, and. The police would do away in the stroke of a pen with even collectors, legitimate collectors that would be collecting weapons that I think are part of South Africa and Southern Africa's history. So again, very, very disappointing. To come to your comment about the ammunition, under these proposals, they are also proposing that you would be allowed a maximum of 100 rounds. You would be allowed to be in possession of a maximum of 100 rounds per caliber. So preposterously, I took part in an IPSC shoot on Saturday, and training event on Saturday. And the minimum round count for that event was 8 stages, was 170 rounds. They would also have us believe that you apply to your local police station for authorization and permission to be transporting that ammunition, those 100 rounds, to the range, and you would need to apply each and every time. Now, given how inefficient the police are, there's no way you would get authorization in time. You know, I registered on Monday for the shoot on Saturday. There's no way the police would have a turnaround time of 3-4 days. There's no way. So again, it's just preposterous. It wouldn't work. Sadly, some of this is political, and there seems to be an ongoing move by our authorities, including our police and the CFR, to disarm the civilians, when the data and evidence is not supportive of that being necessary. Of course, there are some negligent civilians who lose weapons or have them stolen, but the stats seem to suggest that by far and away the biggest categories of organizations that lose weapons are the military to a degree and the police, and then our metro police forces, which are typically your municipal police forces that also have weapons allocated to them. And until not that long ago, police stations did not have a hard and fast sign in and sign out book where it'd be, you know, Corporal Neil Taylor is checking out this and this weapon, this many rounds, serial number, blah, blah, blah. It would just be a weapon would be checked out and checked in. At the end of a month or 2 months or 6 months, they couldn't reconcile why they were missing 3 full automatic, you know, 5.56 rifles. It's ridiculous. And yet the push is to disarm civilians. You're on, I think you're on.
I don't know if my brother is on here this morning, but my brother was on an international training team, training law enforcement groups around the world. And he did a lot of work in East and West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the Caribbean. And he talks about, you know, the United States of America would give them boats to control their coastline. And they'd like, yeah, the boats aren't working. I don't know what happened. And they go out there and like, they're just out of gas. Did you not check that? Or, yeah, this one's broke down. Like, well, you didn't put oil in it. You know, we trained you on all this. And so I think we see some of the things. I mean, here in America, I think we take for granted the professionalism that we have with our police. And yet there is a growing current that wishes to defund the police. And I think we have seen reimagining the police force and defunding the police force from what you guys had pre-1994 until now has not been good for your country. Let's get to some of the comments here, Neil. Johnny says it would be easier to blow a bubble with a jawbreaker than to buy a weapon in South Africa.
Absolutely right, Johnny.
Linda says, what if one inherits a firearm or firearms? Is it accumulating more than 4? Is that allowed? What would you have to do there?
Linda, that's a good question. So again, you know, it becomes so technical that a regular person then struggles to know what their rights are. My advice to someone would be, in those circumstances, get yourself certified, join a club, become certified as a dedicated sports shooter. And there would be requirements in order to be certified as such. But once you've done that, then you could apply for your 5th license. Dedicated sports shooters or hunters, or whatever, who can justify it correctly, can own multiple shotguns, can own multiple rifles, can own multiple pistols of the same caliber. But remember, every single one is motivated, and you need to, as I've had to do, I've recently applied for another pistol license, compare and contrast to say, I've got this Glock pistol, it's different, it fits in this and this division of IDPA. I'm now applying for a CZ Shadow 2. It only fits in this and this. It's made specifically for the production optics division of IPSC, and it differs from the weapons I already own. It's bigger, and you know, it's developed and designed specifically for the PO division, etc. So you need to be quite articulate and quite precise, because otherwise I think the CFR would tend just to reject the application. In the case of inheritance, my view would be, instead of swimming against the stream, it would be easier to get yourself certified as a dedicated sports shooter, or if it's a hunting type rifle, dedicated hunter. Again, your hunting organizations will not allow you to apply, and they will not endorse weapons that are not suitable for hunting purposes. So for instance, if the caliber is too light for legitimate South African plains game hunting, they won't grant it. A 2.2 long rifle, they will not grant as a hunting weapon, or not readily grant, because it's not authorized and permissible under our provincial or national regulations for hunting purposes. And someone a while ago tried to be clever and said to me, no, we'll just say I need a 2.2 long rifle as a training weapon. The CFR would then require you, and I have children, I have 2 sons, and I grew up in a household where we were trained in safe firearm handling and accuracy and marksmanship from a very young age. And I'm doing the same with my sons. But the problem is, if I were to say I need this 2.2 long rifle because I want to train my kids, which I think is a legitimate purpose, they would want professional training accreditations, notwithstanding the fact I've owned weapons for, I think it's something like 39 years of my life.
Yeah, that's amazing. Alan Kelly says, with the current situation and civil disturbances and firearms owners helping the police, even giving ammunition to the police, do you think that might help your fight for firearms rights or hamper those fights?
Alan, I'm sorry to say, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I'm sorry to say I do not trust our senior members of our police force and certainly people within the CFR. They seem to only give credence and lend their ear to members of the Gun Free South Africa organization, which is a George Soros funded organization. I would like to think that, given the fact that civilians were the thin blue line during our recent riots, that the bill as it's currently drafted would be scrapped in its totality. And certainly firearm owners and enthusiasts like me are calling for it to be scrapped, not amended, not cut back, scrapped in totality. We already have very strong, very arduous firearm laws and regulations. They just need to police the law, and they need to stop the leaking of weapons from government and related sources, in my opinion.
Yeah, John is joining us, Neil, from Yukon, Oklahoma, coin number 1919. Thank you, John, for being on. Tony says the Czech Senate just voted to include a Second Amendment type law into their constitution. That's fantastic.
That is brilliant. That is so good.
Yako says it's a double-edged sword. It can help us, but from the political view, if you look at what the government wants to achieve, it can hamper or do more harm, as they have now seen that the citizens band together, which can be a threat to their rule, hence trying to disarm us. He makes a strong point.
Yeah, firstly, Yaku, good morning. How are you, my friend? Yaku's a member of one of my sporting associations. It's a military club. And of course, my comments directed at certain members of the police and military is not to demean and undermine the number of very good, hardworking men and women who are police officers and, of course, soldiers. We have some great people in our armed forces and our security services. Still, unfortunately, I think there is a lot of rot, and I'm sure Yaku would agree with me.
What's interesting about South Africa, I made this point to Manhar, and again, in all due respect, having never been to South Africa, having looked at it from a distance, it would appear that there is this huge swath of middle ground, everything from the most incompetent police that you could imagine to the very, very tip of the spear with the South African Special Task Force, which are among the best in the world that have ever been. And there's very little middle ground, it would appear. I mean, you've got lots of video of police looting that are engaged in looting themselves in South Africa. So it's very disheartening to see that going on.
Yeah. And I mean, that brings into question amongst law-abiding people, why must I obey the law if nobody else is, if the authorities are not? And I'm not proposing that people should not obey the law, but the problem is it's a very slippery slope. If you have someone that's indigent and on the borderline of being able to provide for his or her family, and they see their neighbors going out and looting and stealing stuff and coming back with goods they could not otherwise afford, and if they see there are no consequences for that action, inevitably the mob is bigger tomorrow, and the day after it's even bigger, and the day after. It's almost like the Rudy Giuliani theory of I think when he was mayor of New York in the 80s or early 90s, where he had zero tolerance for vagrancy, for broken windows, for jaywalking. And I think that's the correct approach. You need to see that there are consequences for your actions. If there are no consequences, there will be more illegal behavior, in my opinion.
Yeah, and regardless of what one may think about Rudy Giuliani in the last year or so, I would encourage the the listener or watcher, viewer of today's show to read Rudy Giuliani's book on leadership, on how he cleaned up New York. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
Can't recommend it enough. Let's talk about the riots, Neil. I'm going to give a little context to the American listener of today's show or watcher. Last year, in all of 2020, during our riots and cities burning, from what I could find online this morning, there was 25 reported deaths from those riots here in the U.S. In South Africa, as of this morning, 337 and counting. So per capita, if you adjust for population size, that's about that would be like 1,600 deaths in just a couple of weeks. And we're talking about, I think one of the stats I saw this morning, Neil, was roughly like 50 billion rand, and the gross domestic product of South Africa is like 300 billion. And when we talk about GDP per capita here in America, we have almost 70,000 per capita GDP. In South Africa, not even quite 6,000 GDP. So to your point about when you see your neighbor coming back with a flat screen, you couldn't have a flat screen, probably ever, unless you looted one, because it's just not, you're never going to make that kind of money for the average, probably South African living in a shanty town. Am I incorrect in any of that?
No, I think you're broadly correct. I can't speak to the exact figures, but they sound about right. The cost of the looting has, initial estimates, I think were 15 and then 20 billion rand. And I made a little note here. So that is, even at 20 billion rand, 1.35 billion US dollars on today's exchange rate. I mean, that's an insane amount of money.
And the looting, let's talk about, how did this get started? Neil, take us back. Did you guys see this coming? I mean, Zuma, the former president, Zuma is a Zulu. I know that sounds confusing, but he comes out of office. You've got Cyril Ramaphosa, a lot of expectations for him to maybe increase the South African economy. So a lot riding on him. And then did we see that this was coming with Zuma?
I don't think we anticipated it would be that bad. If I can just give your listeners and viewers a bit of a recap of the background to this, because some news outlets would have you believe that Zuma is being persecuted, A, because he's a former president by the current president, and B, because he's a Zulu by a current president who's not a Zulu, who's from a different tribe. So the background is there have been tons of allegations against Zuma and people that reported to him, going as far back as the arms deal in the late 1990s, where his personal financial advisor was subsequently, after much toing and froing, he was found guilty and sentenced to a period of imprisonment. And shortly thereafter, and by shortly, I think he got a 10-year sentence, something like that. And after serving about 18 months or 2 years, he was let out on medical grounds because he was on the verge of death. Well, 10 years later, the individual's name is Shabir Sheikh, he's still up and around and playing golf. So that's amazing. But subsequently, there have been all sorts of allegations and claims of state capture, where it's been alleged that the government and members within the government and the Zuma regime were captured by an Indian family, and all sorts of corrupt dealings took place that we are led to believe caused billions and billions and billions of rand to be lost from the country. And there are all sorts of allegations brought against him. Now, I'm not just talking off bat here. There is currently a commission of inquiry, ironically, where the now Chief Justice, Zondo, was appointed when Zuma was still the president to oversee this commission of inquiry. And it's been running 2.5, close to 3 years now. It's cost the country R1 billion. And they're hundreds and hundreds of pages, thousands of pages of testimony, and thousands of witnesses have been called to testify, one of whom was Zuma. And Zuma came to testify, where he's interrogated as if it was in a court of law and under some of the rules of a court of law. And he obviously was not happy with how he was being cross-examined or questioned vis-a-vis the existing testimony of other witnesses. And at a point in time, he and his legal advisors, of course, he arrived with legal advisors. We have the right to legal defense and to not incriminate yourself. And at a point in time, notwithstanding the fact he had advisors with him, they left this commission. They were then called back, and he ignored the request of the presiding officer, this Judge Zondo. Subsequently, the secretary of the commission then approached the highest court of our land, called our constitutional court, for an order of the court to, instruct and require Zuma, former President Zuma, to arrive. He ignored that. They then brought contempt of court proceedings. Now, Zuma's behavior in the last 10 to 15 years has been to duck and dive. He never appears for court. They delay. They play every technical game. And as a lawyer, I've been frustrated by these games, because underwriting all of this is the taxpayer. And the taxpayer, the allegations are the taxpayer is being defrauded to the tune of many, probably hundreds of billions of rand. So Zuma was eventually found guilty of contempt of court. The judgment was handed down towards the end of June, and the ruling gave him a period, I think, of about 5 or 6 days within which to hand himself in to one of 2 police stations, one near his residence and the other in Johannesburg. And of course, we and many other people were watching this very closely, and of course, he failed and refused to do so. Fortunately, the order said, in the alternate, if he does not hand himself in by the Sunday night, then by, and I'm just looking at my notes here, Wednesday, and I'm looking at my calendar, the 7th of July, the Minister of Police and the police commissioner were ordered under that court order to arrange for his arrest. And in the days leading up to this, notwithstanding the fact South Africa is in a very stringent lockdown level 4, Zuma's supporters started arriving, and they weren't all wearing masks, and they were breaching the lockdown regulations and requirements. They were massing. There were public gatherings. We had not Zuma, but members of his family and his supporters publicly addressing people, all of which were in breach of our disaster regulations under COVID protocols. There were although the police were monitoring, there were no arrests. Now, if we ran something that was breaching COVID protocols, be it a church gathering or a shooting outing that was breaching, we would be arrested. There were no arrests that followed. So all along, the current authorities have played softly with Zuma and his supporters. Anyway, it came to, literally, we were watching with bated breath because, as I say, the deadline was missed by Zuma to hand himself in. And eventually, and again, it's unclear what really happened, but it appears that his close protection detail were given instructions to arrest him. They were in his residential compound, and eventually 5 or 6 blacked out vehicles left the Nkandla compound, and he was driven late at night because the deadline was obviously the end of that evening, and supposedly taken to a secure facility. Now, it's important people realize this is for contempt of court only. It was a 15-month sentence. This has nothing to do with the arms deal, with the allegations of state capture, with the very many allegations that have been brought against Zuma over the last few years. And under South Africa's parole guidelines, I understand that he is likely to serve only 4 months of a 15-month sentence. So that's the background and context to and I'll get into what happened once he was incarcerated, if you like, unless you have questions before then.
Yeah, let's deal with a couple of questions here. Tony says, with the acquisition of firearms so stringent, how was Manhar able to sport an AR? And Yako says he has a security company which then allows the security personnel to have SLRs. It falls under a business license. Speaking under corrections, though, not my field. You think that's accurate? That's
right, Tony. So there are different ways one can license a weapon. Either you license a weapon to yourself as a civilian, or you license a weapon or weapons to a business. And again, if you want to do it to a business, then in Manhar's case, I understand he runs his own private security company. He would need to have certain professional accreditations and certifications. And again, on behalf of the business, he would need to justify why he has an ops room and he has whatever it is, 15 vehicles that go out or 50 vehicles. I don't know how big the operation is. And typically they would have one armed officer in the vehicle or maybe 2. So he would have more than likely applied under a business license for firearms. Now, it's important that people also realize that once you have this dedicated sports shooter status, provided your sports shooting organization deems it appropriate and relevant, you can apply for something like a semi-automatic AR. Again, your accredited, recognized, registered sports shooting association would need to confirm Neil Taylor is indeed a dedicated sports shooter with us. He is active. He does participate in this. And the AR, the caliber, the make, the model is suitable for this in this division. So again, that's the fail-safe. The authorities can rely not on the individual applying because it's backed up by certifications, typically with barcodes that they can independently verify and vet. Neil did get dedicated sports shooter status. Neil has got this endorsement. Yeah, but that was a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And Tony says, sounds like every citizen should form a private security company. Yeah, whatever it takes. Yeah. So I want to also go back for the Americans that are watching that are like really unfamiliar with South Africa. One of the things when you were growing up, Neil, and I don't want to speak for you, but the ANC, the African National Congress, was more of a terrorist organization, as I understand it, than anything. You know, Zuma was I think in prison for like almost 10 years with Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was in prison for 20 plus years. And these were people that were killing civilians in South Africa, as I understand it. They were, they were not good people. And now they're the ruling party in your country. That must be very strange to intellectualize.
Yeah. So obviously, as a South African, we've got a very checkered history. And sadly, our background, in our fairly recent history, we had a system of apartheid that was brought about by the previous nationalist government. And because there was segregation of races, and there was, if people were required to live in different areas under the Group Areas Act, you had organizations like the African National Congress that were trying to oppose that. And I think at a point in time where they saw that they were gaining no traction, they then took up armed means as a means to try and bring about change in the country. Now, for your viewers, it's important also to realize that very many South Africans who happen to be of different racial categorizations or of former, European descent were not necessarily behind the nationalist government. My background is, my ancestors hail from Britain and from Ireland, and we as a family, I'm talking my parents, my grandparents, were opposed to it. So the irony is, South Africans who happen to be of European descent often get tarred with the same brush as though all of us supported the then regime, all of us are pro-apartheid, all of us are automatically racist, and that is patently wrong. The irony is there are some people in our country that have never had their own party be the ruling party, and that's very frustrating. But anyway, so the ANC turned to armed means. They mobilized and they undertook guerrilla tactics, which to a degree entailed planting landmines on farm roads, attacking remote farmhouses, planting bombs in shopping centers, attacking non-military and non-police facilities, attacking schools and so on. So I think they would justify it as necessary in the circumstances. I must say I don't agree with that. And if I was in their shoes, I think you have to attack facilities or institutions that are part of the government, in my opinion. I don't see how attacking a school and shooting up a farmyard of men and women and children makes you a freedom fighter. But anyway, that is part of our history. And unfortunately, tied to the way the ANC mobilized the people is they encourage people to riot and demonstrate and burn things and throw petrol bombs in their communities and to destroy the infrastructure and so on. And we are seeing now that they are the ruling party, a carryover of those sorts of tactics where if you're not happy with the headmaster of the school, and this has happened recently in the last year or two, the parents or members of the community petrol bombed the entire school. So the school got burned down. So that community now has no school. So it's like cutting off your nose to spite your face. And it's a mentality today with a democratically elected government I don't really understand.
No, I don't understand it either. Has the Have you seen the racialization of the riots in any way with what's going on right now?
Yeah, so if I could just take us back, if you don't mind, Rich. So
Please.
With Zuma being arrested on that Wednesday night, the 7th of July, as I say, people had been amassing and loitering around his compound. He's got a massive compound in a rural part of KwaZulu-Natal, probably an hour and a half out of Durban, which is one of our coastal cities. And very shortly thereafter, people started rioting. Now, you asked earlier, was this anticipated? I don't think it was anticipated to the degree that things lit up like they did. But it was clear people were already being allowed to break lockdown regulations. They were already being allowed to make inflammatory commentary against the current government. The police were standing idly by. And it's amazing. During that week, I was actually saying, why are the police not enforcing lockdown regulations? Where is the military to back up the police? Now, I'm not, as a lawyer, I understand the constitutional risk that one runs where you have military fulfilling civilian policing role. It's not their role, it's not their responsibility. I'm on a WhatsApp group with Yaku and other friends from our club, and I know the military men, they are very cautious about it because there's no upside for them. The troops deployed are not equipped correctly. They're not trained to do civilian policing, but of necessity, they've been brought in. And thank goodness they have, because they brought about stability. But there's no upside to them. And when they enforced the lockdown in late March of last year, that's how long we've been in lockdown, there are all sorts of allegations and claims of military brutality on civilians and so on and so forth. So there's no real upside to them. But anyway, the looting on Thursday and Friday and over the weekend happened. And it happened all over the place, to the extent that our national roads, our highways were shut down. The N2 and the N3 around Durban and KwaZulu-Natal were shut down, which is a criminal offense. You may not shut down highways, as you may not shut them down, I'm sure, in the US. People were mingling. There was no, which is again illegal under the lockdown regulations. And then worse still, there seemed to be orchestrated mobs that attacked shopping centers and facilities, and in some cases were threatening to overrun some of the civilian areas, as the suburbs, residential suburbs. And there were either no police or very few police around, and clearly they were ill prepared to stop these illegal gatherings and to stop these riotous assemblies. And the thin blue line became civilians. Civilians came out in their numbers to defend their communities, to defend their shops and their properties and their businesses. And the police were either not there at all or were woefully ill-equipped. I sent you earlier today an article, and if you feel it appropriate, you're welcome to post it. It's from one of our independent news outlets on the intelligence and the failures and failings between our different intelligence services and our police as to why they were caught with their proverbial pants down as these mobs were mobilized.
Yeah, and the article that Neil speaks of is in today's show notes, so please check that out. Let's go ahead and take a quick share break. If you have any questions for Neil, please post them in the comments below, and we'll see if we can get to them today. Please take that share break with someone that needs this information, because if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. And like Manhar said, he has always been his opinion that we're about 10 years behind the disaster, which I think is probably highly accurate. One of the articles that I read said something to the effect of that the unrest also reflects despair over years of joblessness and hunger worsened by the pandemic. This was not a Zuma issue. It was a ticking time bomb. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that to a degree, and I'll qualify why I'm giving you a qualified answer. So if this was all about indigent people, poor people who had no food, then the looting would have been of food shops and supermarkets where food and water and drinks maybe were stolen. In reality, our shopping centers and shops that did high-end luxury goods were raided. So the Nike store was raided, as happened in America during your riots. The superstores that sell kitchen appliances, we're talking plasma, massive plasma screen TVs, lounge suites, fridges, freezers, microwaves, luxury car places were petrol bombed. If it was only motivated by hunger, then the extent of the looting would not have occurred where it did. The second thing is, I agree. Our economy prior to COVID was already a stuttering economy. There have been very weak and poor government policies that make South Africa a less attractive source for inward investment. It's very difficult to run a business here because there's layers and layers of red tape and policy by government that, in my opinion, as a business lawyer, adds little value and creates lots of additional costs for business owners. And this is not only my opinion. We've got an esteemed economist called Clem Sunter. He's a former Anglo-American person. He writes very widely, and he's been criticizing a bunch of the government initiatives that incentivize and oblige certain businesses to only hire people from certain racial categories, which he says is inefficient and is not resulting in positive business practices. So our economy was weak. We've got difficult red tape and government policies that restrict the success of some businesses. There's lots of government meddling. There's government inefficiency. So if you want to deal with government, it's incredibly complex. They're terrible payers, and if you're lucky if they pay you on 120 days. So if you layered a big project to supply something to government, they will string you along for months and months and months. So as a small business, you're going to go out of business. And of course, our unemployment rate on the official published figures by government is sitting at something like 32%. Wow. The worrying aspect, even which is even worse, is the individuals from 18 to 25 is over that percentage. So the young upcoming people who have just finished school have very little prospects to get a job. And of course, the education system is failing because it's been presided over and run by the government departments very poorly. So the kids coming out of school are poorly equipped to go into a business setting, to run what I would say are fairly basic requirements of most businesses, understanding invoicing, understanding computers, having literacy in those fields. So that means there's a lot of unemployed youth who, to a degree, are unemployable, which is very dangerous.
It is very dangerous. And if you're just joining us, I want to go ahead and welcome you into the show. We're talking to Neil Taylor from South Africa. He is a South African and British corporate attorney, hunter, and competitive shooter, and we're discussing the recent unrest in South Africa, his country. One of the things that we touched, let's see, Alan has a question or a comment here. With the destruction of food stores, gas stations, infrastructure facilities, and general goods, are there shortages? And if so, will the government take action to help, or will the situation languish?
Yeah, Alan, that's a great question. So people, ironically, are like flocks of birds. If you ever watch a flock of birds, the bird at the front jinxes for whatever reason, and all the birds following jinx at the same time. And with this rioting and with concerns and, our journalists saying, there are going to be food shortages and petrol, what you call gasoline shortages, people have stockpiled, which of course has put more demand on the routes that are already restricted. I mean, they are open now, our national highways, but they, for a bunch of days, were actually shut because there were riots, demonstrations and protests and riots taking place. So the trucks and the railways were not able to, trains were not able to take supplies from our coastline and from our ports in and around KwaZulu-Natal, KZN, up into the interior where I and other people live. And this is our economic hub. Pretoria and Johannesburg is where a lot of the big business is done. And it was worrying. So there were shortages. I think they were experienced a lot worse in areas of KwaZulu-Natal that were looted terribly, but also in some of the township areas in and around Johannesburg, in certain areas of Johannesburg that also had massive riots and protests and demonstrations and looting. So there were shortages. I would say it felt a lot worse in parts of KZN and in some of the smaller towns where their biggest supermarket was petrol bombed, where everything was stolen and destroyed. And a lot of the time there wasn't just looting, there was malicious destruction of property such that entire shops and buildings will need to be knocked down. It wasn't just, I'm hungry, I'm going to steal food. It's, I'm going to trash everything, I'm going to petrol bomb it, I'm going to destroy it. In some cases, it looked like bombs had been set in shopping precincts, such that the entire precinct is destroyed. Will government take action? our current president, President Ramaphosa, spoke to the nation last night, and he's indicated that he will be making, or the government will be making, certain social welfare grants available to some of our indigent citizens, but it's at a tiny, tiny level. He spoke of grants of 350 Rand. I'm assuming he means per month. And, if you divide that by about 14 or 15, I mean, we're talking, what's that? $20 a month. I mean, it's nothing.
Yeah. And John asked the question, what organization is behind organizing the coordinated looting? And some of the ways that they're coordinating the looting, just at the very simplest way, which I thought was pretty brilliant, is if you want to destroy this mall or this piece of infrastructure, they would light tires on fire and it would show the hordes of looters where's the next target, which I thought was very simple and effective plan.
Rich, there have actually been articles, and the background to the looting is becoming more clear. The looters, it sounds like, were actually organized on social media. And I get the sense during your riots in the US, the looters there and the protesters were organized using social media. So what happened, and I have this from eyewitness accounts and the accounts of many journalists who were there during the looting, mobs of 2, 3, 4, 5,000 people would descend on a shopping precinct in this or that town or this or that part of Durban. And it was clear they had been prepped as to what they would be doing. So they attacked and they gathered foodstuffs, certainly, but also all sorts of luxury goods. They raided all sorts of stores. They broke and destroyed buildings and so on. Behind that, it sounds like there were up to 12 politically connected people. This is according to journalistic reports I've read, some of whom, or certainly 2 of whom, have been fingered as being former President Zuma's son and daughter. The son, ironically, seems to be thinking that he's eligible to run for president in the next general elections in the next few years. And they were inciting violence. The demonstrations and protests and violence that was starting, they were encouraging. And I mean, the crazy thing is you've got reams of this on social media. So there's evidence and proof that this is what people were doing. Yeah. So notwithstanding the fact that people have been implicated, our president spoke again last night to those behind the rioting will be brought to book. We're sitting now, and most of the worst rioting took place, let's say, from about the 7th to about the 15th or 16th of July. There's been one arrest of some low-level DJ. It just seems ridiculous. I don't see why, if people have been implicated, they're not brought in post-haste for strong interrogation to determine whether or not they were actually involved and whether or not they were inciting the violence.
Yeah, and I saw one report where there was like 10 or 11 people that were crushed in the rush to loot something, and I saw another one where every single store was picked to the bare bones of the walls, with the exception of the bookstore. So, like you and I were speaking yesterday, it was my comment that if you wanted to hide something in South Africa, hide it inside of a book because it would be safe there.
Let it be said that is not the general case. I think law-abiding citizens, as with many other countries, we read very widely. We try and stay up to date with current affairs, but certainly with the looters, I think bookstores were not of interest.
No, which is a shame. What is here's what bothers me, I guess, about what's going on in your country. There is no reason why South Africa should be in this position. You have great mineral wealth. Your geography couldn't be any better. You're right there in the shipping area, and you've got a labor-ready workforce. I think it's just these terrible policies by your government. And I remember, you were saying that they have made it so arduous to get a business going there. And I recall that there was a woman saying, please stop sending shoes to South Africa. She was a South African businesswoman that was trying to start a shoe company. And she said, every time Americans send free shoes over here, I can't sell shoes. And it's one of those things that there's well-intentioned things that the West is doing that really is probably part of the problem in sub-Saharan Africa. I
mean, Rich, that's exactly right. As a business lawyer, and I spent and worked as a solicitor, an English lawyer in the UK, in London, for 11 years. And during that time, I obviously did corporate deals all over the world, including into the US. When I give advice to foreign clients of our firms, some of whom hark and hail from America, they cannot understand that things take so long. So whereas, a simple example, in the United Kingdom, you have something called the Companies House. It's basically the registrar of companies. So changing and appointing directors for your business, typically if you lodge it today, it takes, I think it's 1 to 2 business days. In South Africa, that can take up to 3 months.
Wow.
And in my previous role as a partner in one of the big firms, I oversaw the company section, and I had endless negotiations and discussions with senior people within our companies and intellectual property commission to try and explain and justify how fraud was being perpetrated on our clients and why they needed to change and update their directors' records. Because, of course, because it's a public document, people rely on those. If they get an order from Rich Brown and they look at the company and they see Rich Brown is still appointed as a director of that company, they'll believe that the order from Rich Brown is appropriate and correct. And that's what a fraudster was doing. And the CIPC would not listen to me as a partner of a, well-respected law firm saying, you need to expedite this, not for my client, but because frauds are being perpetrated. And they would not listen. They were not flexible. They thought I was trying to fast track a very minor matter for my client, whereas I was trying to prevent fraud of this company. Anyway, very frustrating.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And again, it goes back to something that, I think when one of our politicians in recent memory said something like these countries in sub-Saharan Africa are crap hole countries, I'll be polite. He's not talking about the people, folks. He's talking about the governments that put in this insane bureaucracy that make it hard to get anything done. Yeah. And cause the people in their country's economic situation to languish. But I want to talk about the state of the South African law enforcement. What is the state currently of South African law enforcement relative to where we saw maybe pre-apartheid?
So the South African police force used to be, I think, a very proud policing organization. And with the transition from the apartheid era into the democratic state that happened in 1994, obviously there was a transition of people, both new recruits and existing people, into the policing function. And at the point of the changeover, I understand that a lot of more senior people were urged, particularly if they were of the wrong racial group, to take an early retirement. The downside of that, and to a degree that happened in the military as well, the downside of that is your institutional knowledge was to a degree lost, because people who would otherwise have mentored and trained younger people coming into the service for decades to bring them up to be a top-level investigator and detective were lost because they retired at age 50. They didn't see out their years. I have a bunch of friends who are policemen and women currently still serving in the police force. And I feel terribly, terribly sorry for them, because I think they have to make do with, poor recruiting practices by the service, with inadequate equipment and supply and procurement of that, with insufficient ammunition. I have it on good authority, some ammunition, there've been delays with the procurement of ammunition for our police service, which would explain why on the riots, the police were running out of ammunition, which required the civilians to give the police ammunition. And it's the most preposterous thing. But that's because of procurement errors and delays with procuring. So I think very poor recruiting practices on the whole. I think people that are there that are good are working under very trying circumstances, and many of them are going into the independent armed response companies. They're retiring or they're making the best of it, but they're not being properly supported or remunerated or equipped. And I think there's huge politicization at the upper ranks. And that, the link that I sent you to that article talks to that, where our Minister of Police and Police Commissioner are not seeing eye to eye, and they're undermining each other and second-guessing each other. Our IPID, Independent Police Inspectorate Division, that investigates complaints against the police, is being overrun and run roughshod over by the police. Our intelligence services, apparently they passed on information relating to the possible rioting and looting that would follow to the police, and the police ignored it. So the police were not ready, even though people had been massing around in Kandla in the days prior to the looting taking place. So I think our police force is in a state of shambles. There are, and again, this is an article I read, it's probably a year and a half ago, there are estimated to be up to 30% of the police force have a criminal record. Now, those are the people that are meant to be enforcing the laws of the land. Many of them, if you get pulled over by the police, they're seeking a bribe. They're blatantly seeking a bribe. And because there's no enforcement, no consequences for poor action and misbehavior, people that were otherwise, I think, okay policemen and women see their colleagues not getting arrested for illegal actions that they took as police officers. They are, it's spreading. So it's very, very worrying. And I mean, what does one do as a father? What do I tell my children? I'm not comfortable telling them, if you get separated, go to the nearest policeman. I do not trust the police force, and I'm a law-abiding person. On the whole, I think the average police officer is not to be trusted and not to be relied upon, and we saw that. It was reinforced with the looting and the rioting.
Yeah, that's tragic. And Rob Pincus is on. Good morning, sir. He says, I had the honor and pleasure of teaching some courses in South Africa for civilians and police. It is a gorgeous country with some awesome people, far too many of whom have needed their arms and training to defend themselves. The current troubles are tragic. I look forward to returning sometimes. Yeah, and like I said with Manar, I had my wife that close talked into going to South Africa, and I think she's getting cold feet now because of what's going on there. But hopefully I can re-talk her into it.
If I can just touch on that, Rich,
Yeah.
For your viewers who may not know me, I'm not a naysayer. I'm a person who was living and was set up in the UK, and I decided with my wife and young children to come back to South Africa to try and give back, to give my international exposure and experience, and try and come back to my home country, which was and continues to be a third world country, and make a difference. Our country is amazing. We have an amazing climate. Our country, I understand, is obviously not as big as America. It's about the size of Texas, but it is massive and it is diverse, both in terms of our ecology and our people. And we are an interesting melting pot, which reflects our history. And my honest view is, if we could just get a clean government and competent politicians and leaders into power, and then incentivize people on the basis of merit, not skin color, we can turn things around. Because us as taxpayers are paying through our noses in terms of the direct and indirect taxes. So the money is there. And that's what frustrates me most. If you're an incompetent politician and you do second dealings on behalf of provincial government with your brother and uncle and cousin and son, that money is lost to the fiscus. If you are just incompetent and you wastefully spend and procure goods that are unnecessary or not fit for purpose, that money is lost to the fiscus, and therefore the taxpayer is not getting value for money. And the worry is that more and more the most poor, the poorest communities, with the money that's been lost or stolen or corruptly diverted, are lost to those communities. So rural health clinics, local police stations, infrastructure, I'm talking roads and electricity and water reticulation and decent housing, could be provided, and frankly should be provided, because we are paying tax rates not dissimilar to what people pay in Europe. It's just probably a third of it, half of it's being diverted for unlawful illegal means, and seemingly there are no repercussions. That's why I'm frustrated. I feel very much, because the poorest of the poor are really struggling. And then you have the overlay of a weak economy and then COVID with our lockdown regulations and restrictions. It's been alleged, it's been estimated that we've shed over 1 million jobs since lockdown started in late March last year. 1 million jobs.
And that's 1 million that you can't afford to lose when you already have one of the highest unemployment rates. Yako says, if the African continent as a whole can be stable and governed properly, Africa will be the richest continent, and that can also be a threat to the outside world. So now begs the question, why or who is stirring the pot? Wearing my tinfoil hat. Yeah, that's a great question. And Yako also says, Rich, if you come to visit, I will run your VIP detail. Okay, brother. As soon as they ease the lockdown, guess what? We're going to make it happen.
Well, I mean, the irony is people that visit South Africa, and we have hosted very many times our international guests and friends. And as with anything, if you go to a country where there is a crime rate, if you go to South America, if you go to places within Southeast Asia where there is a crime rate, you need to know. So the local knowledge helps. But the people, the family and friends and others that we have shown around the country, they've had an absolutely amazing time. I mean, we've got, African wilderness that you can't experience but in sort of sub-Saharan Africa. We've got mountains, we've got seas, we've got first world facilities and restaurants and experiences, be it cage diving with sharks and so on. And unfortunately, none of that really hits the press. The negativity surrounding South Africa and the looting is what hits the press. And it's very sad because what we most need, and what I've said for years, we need to drive in a hugely ambitious way our tourism and our ecotourism and our conservation opportunities and our sustainable hunting. And negativity, I understand, cancels trips. And that's the sad fact of where things stand currently.
Well, and in all fairness, I mean, Todd Fox has been on here before, and he was the bodyguard for Madonna and Guy Ritchie and just about every other celebrity you can imagine. But I don't want to go visit him in St. Louis either, or there's a lot of places in America I have no intention of going. Yeah. But Dr. T.C. Fuller is on from South Carolina, says coin number 1620. Good morning, sir. I want to ask you, where is all this lawlessness going? The recent events in your country have shown probably a bigger crack than a lot of us folks thought was there in South Africa. So where is it all heading, Neil?
My personal view, I mean, I was a law student at the time that South Africa was transitioning into a free and fair democratic country. And it was great. I was in a law faculty and we were studying the drafts and redrafts of our constitution, which is one of the most forward-thinking constitutions. It's a mishmash of the American Constitution, which is obviously very old, but then more modern constitutions, dare I say, like the German and other constitutions. And it was a fascinating period. So while I believe in constitutionally enshrined rights, like clearly the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech, I do think that people in public office should need to be held to account, because they are the ones that are pushing an agenda. They are the ones that are continuing to seek racial divide in our country. And the amazing thing, if you look very closely to the footage of the rioting and the civilians that were defending against that, defending business districts, defending residential suburbs, those were South African men and women of all hues. Those were not divided along racial lines like the politicians or outsiders would have others believe. The average law-abiding South African citizen is a very resilient person who gets down and does things. That's who we are. Unfortunately, I think we're completely hamstrung by our politicians that are factional. And to a degree, I think some of the riots, I personally believe, and some journalists have suggested, this was a civil insurrection akin to an attempted coup and overthrowing of the current government. And it appears to be, we will see in the coming days and weeks, it appears to be different factions within the ANC ruling party. The Zuma, former President Zuma faction, who's pushing for radical economic transformation. And by that, they mean expropriation of land and other property. Property is not defined as land, property, without any compensation being paid if a governor or a politician deems it so. So that could be your share portfolio, that could be your pension, that could be anything, your luxury car. And I wonder where it's going, but the people are inciting the violence. They're encouraging the looting and the racial attacks and the genocide that has launched itself on occasion against nationals of other African states within South Africa. And that's very worrying. And I think people have to be held to account. There's a politician that I hope one day we'll see in orange prison uniform. His name is Julius Malema, and he's with a radical left-wing party called the EFF. And they are forever inciting and threatening and trying to racially divide our country.
Yeah, that the idea of land redistribution and reappropriation, I tell you what, that I don't know why people seem to want to do that. We saw Mugabe do that in Zimbabwe, and we saw it lead to some of the worst hyperinflation in the history of the world. And to think that there's a party in South Africa that wants to do that just blows me away.
Well, Rich, there are two things. There's the EFF, which is a party that's probably the third largest party. They have relatively minimal support. And in the most recent elections, they had actually lost some support, but they're sitting on about 8%. But they promised the world, and they say they understand workers' rights and so on. When these people, have also been implicated in looting of certain state banks and so on and so forth. And the worry is also within the ruling party. There are factions, current serving politicians and members of cabinet that would have us believe that radical economic transformation is the way to go. The famous quote, what concerns me is the famous quote says, those that fail to study history are destined to repeat it. And as you say, just north of our border is Zimbabwe, where these policies were tried and they failed and continue to fail. Zimbabwe is now one of the poorest countries in the world.
And at one point, they were among the richest in the world, just up until 1980, or probably into the 90s. But Julius Malema, the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, or whatever they're called, isn't he the one that chants "kill the Boer" at all of his rallies? And for those Americans that aren't familiar with that term, can you explain what Boer refers to?
Yeah. So it's actually an Afrikaans or a Dutch word, boer, and it means farmer. But implicit in that is a lot of our farmers are people of original Dutch and Germanic descent. So it means kill the Afrikaner, kill the farmer. And again, we touched on this on when I was on your previous show. The ruling party would have us believe that there's no targeting of our farmers, men and women of different racial groups in the rural areas. And I just don't believe that to be correct. It seems that farmers are targeted to a much higher degree than other categories in the same crime class. So, clearly politicians, again, inciting and directing anger towards individuals in the farming community has resulted in lots of attacks on farmers and therefore lots of farmers selling up and leaving and stopping farming, which raises questions about our future food security. But, the politicians don't think that far ahead.
Yeah, and I want to say, Neil, it may have been you that told me about they disbanded the commando units that were the groups of farmers that were trained to be a quick reaction force to come and assist, and they disbanded them with the expressed intent of, we're going to make it better. Trust me, we're coming back with something better, but it never came. Is that correct? That's
right. So in our extended family, I have uncles that farm in rural areas, and as we know, it's probably the same in America. Farmers are often very, very far away from the nearest police force and the nearest town. And growing up, I remember going to spend time on the farms with uncles, and it was called the commandos, and broadly it was people that had undergone military service, and they would be able to retain their R1, a 7.62 rifle, a box of ammunition, military browns. Our defense force used to wear military brown uniforms, and they were set up with CB radios. And if there was ever an attack or an issue, you could call on the farmers from the district. So the advantages are they're living in the area, they know the roads and back roads and routes, and they could respond very, very quickly. And you could mobilize these forces, and many times roadblocks would be set up to catch stock thieves or criminals that had attacked a farm. It was disbanded, as I understand it, under the former President Thabo Mbeki's presidency, with the promise, the undertaking, we're going to disband it, but we will put in place a better equivalent. And we're now sitting, it's probably close to 15, 20 years later, and there's nothing there, and the farmers are almost left on their own,
Yeah, that's tragic. I wanted to talk specifically, what can a reasonable, responsible person do in the situation that you guys find yourself in? And I want to speak specifically, if you can, Neil, to what measures did you and your family and your community take during these deadly riots?
So, Rich, there are a couple of ways for me to answer that. The first thing is, don't leave it too long. Before something happens, so now today, make a note that you're going to look at the security. And I'm talking home defense here and personal family security. So now today, do your own security assessment. If you don't feel competent to do it, I would call in experts. And those typically might be friends that are maybe policemen or women, or people that are security installation people, provided you can trust those individuals. But what we did, coming back to South Africa and moving from the UK back to our home country, I had a security assessment done on the property we bought. And I would say it needs to be a project that is ongoing. There's no quick and easy way to do it. So the first thing is, in South Africa, sadly, many of us live behind 6, 8, 10-foot high walls. We live with multiple layered electric fences. In our case, we have a 10-strand electric fence above about a 2.5 meter high wall. And the electric fence is connected to a siren. So if that fence gets breached, if the circuit gets breached, it will tell me that there's a perimeter breach. Then we have layers of security. We have something called a robo-guard. So it's basically a detector system that gets put on that will detect movement, and it is pet friendly, but detect movement within the garden and outside area of your home. Again, another layer that will be offering us some level of security. In South Africa, because of our crime rate, we have burglar guards and bars on many of the windows, or we have slam shut security gates. And I would say that's not a bad thing to do. On the doors that we don't have those sort of protections on, I've had a reinforced 4-hinge double bolt door built on our front door, so no one can come through that unless they're in a tank. It's very easy, depending on where people are living. I would say look at getting animals, good dogs, and train the dogs. All the dogs we get, I spend time training them. We do poison proofing, because sadly, some of the criminals poison dogs in this country. And then I can talk about the inside inside of houses, if you'd like.
Yeah. So before we get there, one of the things that you and I were talking about yesterday in the pre-show was, we're not talking about a onesie-twosie attack. When they come and try to breach a house, we're talking about upwards of 6, potentially more. Am I correct in that? Yeah.
So sadly, in older times, the average number of attackers, as I understand in American literature, self-defensive literature, would be 1 to 2 attackers on average. And in South Africa, it was probably 1 to 2, maybe 2 to 3 attackers. But it's not uncommon these days for there to be up to 6 in an urban environment, up to 6 people that are doing a home invasion, very regularly, and generally always armed. And in a rural setting, on the farms, I've heard of farm attacks where they are sort of, police response time is 2 hours. There've been up to 15 attackers of a farmer and his family. And that's just ridiculous. I mean, that's like a war zone. That's like a patrol attacking a farming, outpost. So yes, that's not uncommon. So the old, literature that one might be tempted to believe in, yes, have a little pocket pistol with 6 or 7 rounds, that'll be adequate. I mean, that definitely isn't adequate in our context.
No, it's not. And Yako says home burglary 5 to 8, farms can go 12 plus. And that's incredible. I want you to talk about the inside of the home, but one of the questions that I always have is, if a farmer or yourself does use deadly force, how is that looked upon by the by the police? How is that handled?
That's very, very tricky. And again, even as a lawyer, I hope and pray that if it ever comes to that I make the right decision in the split second that I have to assess the situation. But in broad brush strokes, in South Africa, under our constitution, people have a right to life. And therefore, if you use force against an armed attacker, including deadly force, one needs to make sure, and this is the way the law currently stands, that an attack is commenced or is imminent. And it needs to be directed against yourself, being self-defense, or against someone else who may be known to you, but could also be unknown to you. So I could defend a stranger, and that would be private defense, but it has to have commenced or be imminent. And in those circumstances, you can use such opposing force as is deemed appropriate and necessary in the circumstances. And the problem is, in the cold light of day, in a court, 3 to 4 years after the attack, you're going to be called to justify why you didn't retreat further, why you didn't, could you have done this? Theoretically, could you have done that? And you could hear an overzealous state prosecutor might try and prosecute individuals who are otherwise civilian defenders, and legitimately so. Legitimately civilian defenders. And it worries me. Can you always get away? Well, possibly, theoretically. In the reality, probably not. And we unfortunately don't have, and I understand this differs state by state in America, but we don't have the stand your ground legislation. We don't have the castle doctrine. And to a degree, with our crime rate, I think we should bring in one or other of those so that we can legitimately defend our property, defend ourselves. In our law also, you may not defend property. So if someone is trying to steal your vehicle, unless they're endangering your life in doing so, you may not defend the theft or robbery of your property. And that just seems ridiculous. It's saying, it almost seems to embolden the criminals. And that just doesn't make sense.
I guess I'm really shocked that you don't have the Castle Doctrine, because, of course, the Castle Doctrine, as I understand it, comes from English common law, and it was adopted here in the States. But I guess I just assumed that you had the Castle Doctrine in South Africa.
And ironically, Rich, even in the UK, you don't have the Castle Doctrine. There was an interesting matter when we were living in the UK, and it was an elderly gentleman living in a dilapidated rural farmhouse.
Tony Martin?
Yes, Tony Martin, where his police were far away, and his house had been vandalized. And some young yobs broke in, and he ended up shooting one of them with a shotgun. And he was prosecuted and found guilty. Isn't that ridiculous? He was living alone in a rural area that had been vandalized multiple times.
That's absolutely unacceptable. Jaco says they even have cell jammers on the farm attacks, and that is terrifying, because they're stopping your ability to call for help as they come in. That is really scary stuff. Tony says it sounds like the political prosecutors we have today in certain areas of the United States. Yeah, he's absolutely right. Now, can you talk us through the layered external defense that you have? You have a 2.5 meter wall, 10 strands of electrified fence. You've got other countermeasures as they get through. Once they breach the interior, what are some of the steps you have there, Neil?
So, as I say, it's a layered approach that's developed and enhanced and upgraded over time. But what I've also done is, when we moved into this area, I immediately joined up with our community policing forum. And these are the equivalent of Neighborhood Watch. And it's registered and recognized by the police to call in suspicious vehicles, to call for assistance, to, on occasion, patrol our suburbs and work with the police. And over the years, we've done raids, sometimes quite scary stuff, in the middle of the night, in the darkness, into dilapidated houses. We've helped with the arrest of individuals who were illegal aliens, squatting and I think committing criminal acts from a dilapidated house in our residential suburbs, and the like. And with the CPF, we have a CV, civilian band radio system, where every night there's a radio check. So we call in religiously, and you have call signs and whatever. And that's done for a couple of purposes. One, you're checking that your CV radio is correctly programmed, and you know how to operate it, and of course that it's charged. And the second is, at the end of that, they can give updates on, well, this has happened, or be careful of that, or this is an update on this, suburb issue that you might be experiencing. So I think something like that is rather good. I think if all civilians the world over leave it to the police to do the policing, and them only, then we're going to get, find ourselves in a state of shock at some point, because I think the best societies are where the civilians are law-abiding and they dovetail with, respect, and assist the police, in my opinion. Legitimate, I'm not suggesting become a vigilante and chase people down or anything like that. It must be lawful, it must be recognized. And we have, magnets on our car that we're doing patrols. You would identify yourself as CPF. You're not, although under South African law, you may, undertake a citizen's arrest. You typically, as a CPF patroller, would call in to our call center, and they would then notify the armed response companies and or the police to apprehend the suspect. So you're not a policeman. You're there to assist the police. And of course, eyes in the community would often pickup that's a suspicious person or a suspicious vehicle. So CPF is something. Within the house, obviously I secure our family in the family wing. It's an ongoing process, but I'm trying to get my children to understand what needs to be done in this or that scenario. So you run virtual scenarios so that they are hopefully pre-programmed to know what they need to do. Many South Africans are armed as civilians with lawfully registered firearms, and I think inevitably that is necessary in our context. And I'm a big proponent of EDC, of everyday carry. I think it is necessary, and our police forces, even in the urban areas, can take half an hour, 1 hour, 2 hours to respond to emergency calls. So in that time, you can imagine what could happen within your home and in your home context.
Yeah, I tell you, it's not good. As far as raising you're a very intelligent guy, Neil, raising your head up out of South Africa and looking maybe at the entire English speaking world, if you will. And I think there's 11 official languages in South Africa, but what is the biggest threat that you see to the English speaking world?
I think, it seems to me, and it's not something I really understand, but there seems to be a push for irrational norms to become the norm. You and I touched on in the pre-show, there are individuals across the divide in different countries who are given the opportunity to stand on the soapbox and profess to try and cure this and cure that, when a sense test would have a regular person think, well, that doesn't make sense. Logically, how's that going to work? Logically, with South Africa's crime rate, how does disarming the law-abiding civilian population help cure and curb crime? It just doesn't. And yet, more and more, and I see it to a degree in America and certainly in the UK when we lived there, the hard-working, law-abiding man and woman who pays their taxes, who wants to raise their children, who wants to be left in peace and harmony, is being overlooked and instead the politicians would listen to the radical Muslim cleric in the UK that calls for the death and destruction of British forces in Iraq or Afghanistan. It just makes no sense. And that person is there living in Britain on a refugee status visa, being paid for by the British taxpayers to call for the death and destruction of British armed forces. It's ridiculous. That person should be deported back to their country. I mean, I don't know what's happening with, liberal thinkers, but, that sort of thing just doesn't, to me, make sense. And the worst thing is the taxpayer funds that. And I see that to a degree in South Africa.
It's and I hate to say this, but it's somewhat like political correctness run amok. I mean, it's certain not. I think it's the problem that, for lack of a better term, the liberals have with because a lot of the positions I hold are relatively liberal. I'm for tolerance and acceptance and people doing what they wish to do, that's as long as it doesn't hurt anybody. But it has been corrupted with the idea that if you call out someone like the Muslim cleric that's wanting death to the Western world, if you call that out, you're some sort of a xenophobe. And I think that that is just absolutely illogical and irrational behavior.
Yeah,
maybe.
I agree. I would categorize myself as an independent thinker. I'm fairly liberal, but I'm not so liberal that I believe that the ridiculous notions that are presented should all just be accepted without question. I think all of us need, progressive thinkers need to spend time standing up for that which we believe in, and not allowing ourselves to be overrun and silenced by the ridiculous groups that try and propose stuff that clearly isn't helping our societies.
As far as I know, you don't have a crystal ball, Neil, but I always love to ask these kind of questions of the guests that I'm very fortunate to have on the show. Looking into this metaphorical crystal ball, Neil, where do you see the future of your country in the next year or two?
I think we're getting very close to a watershed moment, and it pains and saddens me to say that. It seems clear that for a bunch of years, a split within the ruling party, within the ANC, needs to occur, because there appears to be, and I'm not an ANC supporter, I'm not a member of that organization, but outwardly looking in, there appears to be a much more moderate, slightly more business-friendly, less socialist-leaning grouping within the ANC. And tied to that is this alternate group that seems to be walking behind the banner of former President Zuma, who follow this radical economic transformation, this black nationalist push, who want transformation. By that they mean only for one racial category and actually only for the political elite within that. And who seem to admire the socialist proposal for our country. And I think the sooner the split happens and the sooner we call people to account, because what's worried me as a commentator who understands the law and I think is happy or prepared to call things out, the sooner we have all people in our country realizing there is one rule of law, and the law, will be applied without fear or favor, the better. Because at the moment, you've got the political elite that don't appear to be subject to our laws. Where, a good example, EFF ruler or leader, Malema, had a semi-automatic weapon that he took off one of the security guards at a public political rally, and he fired rounds in an urban area into the sky. That's over 3 years ago. Now, if I did that today, I'd be arrested tonight, and I wouldn't be let off on bail. He has been charged eventually when the outcry became too much, but has not ever, it hasn't really come to trial. It's ridiculous. And it just says to the average citizen, if you're part of the inner circle of the political elite, you're not subject to the law. And I mean, that is just unworkable.
Yeah, you're above the law. That's never good. Yako says, guys, we'll catch up later. Again, off to train. The first rule of Zombieland is cardio. Stay frosty. Alan says irrational norms like what is going on here in the United States, the push for leftist socialistic ideologies, which creates division in our populations, that creates obviously unrest. Tony says, does Mr. Taylor hold the same opinion that the U.S. is only 10 years behind the same fate of South Africa? Great question.
Tony, that's a great question. My family have, over the years growing up and subsequent to that, many friends in America. I have family in America. That said, I can't profess, it would be arrogant of me to profess to know what it is like to live as a citizen in America. I've been to your country many times. Looking from the outside, though, I must say that I'm very concerned by, again, the seemingly unthinking mass that get behind some massive political or politicized event. And, that's very much what we have in South Africa. We have the politicians rabble-rousing, getting the mobs to mobilize behind them for this or that urgent issue. And I mean, that appeared, certainly from the outside, to have been the case in your recent riots in the US. The intelligentsia, or holding leaders to account, or holding the mobs or the organizers liable for the damage caused, I think needs to happen. If you're a unionist party and you lead a march, or you the ANC and you lead a march, and your members or people at your march loot and rob and steal, you must be held liable, almost vicariously liable for the damage. If we do that, I think there'll be better control of people who are in the march. I think the march organizers will then better control and ensure that others don't join. And, we must hold people accountable, because otherwise it's possible that the US will start going the way of South Africa. I mean, you have some safety valves, and that would be your constitutionally enshrined right to own and possess firearms. The fact that your firearm licensing, sequence isn't as long as it is for us in South Africa. I can wait up to a year. I've just made our state team with IPSC in one of the divisions. I could wait up to a year with a motivated license application and, of 10 pages and 60 pages of supporting documents. So I really believe South Africans need to prepare, need to get ready. And I'm not a prepper, but, coming back to what I spoke about earlier, over the years, on and off, I've thought, with my patrolling as a CPF member, do I need body armor? And I thought, no, it's not necessary. I've actually gone out and I bought body armor, including ceramic plates. And I kicked myself when this kicked off because, about 40 kilometers away, there was looting in Johannesburg. That's how far it is from Pretoria. There was looting in the outskirts of Pretoria. And I felt underprepared, even though I'd prepared what I could. So I think it is important that all of us prepare and continue to look at what we have prepared in the context of what is happening now, not what happened 5 years ago, because our environment changes continuously. Have we all done a Stop the Bleed course? Do we all have adequate first aid kits? Do we know how to administer emergency or battlefield first aid? I've just upgraded our first aid kits at home, in my vehicle, at home, what I'll carry with me. Are we all, competent to use a tourniquet? And that might be in the occasion of a vehicle accident. It doesn't all have to be related to firearms. It could be something innocent, like you're hosting a barbecue at your home and someone walks through a plate glass window and one of your guests or a child gets cut and is bleeding terribly. Do you have a tourniquet to hand? Where is it? Can you use it? Do you know how to use it? Those sort of things. And I've spent in the last week time training my young kids on how to apply a tourniquet. So I think all of us, we need to be better prepared, all of us.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And that's probably a great place to lead this discussion. Neil, I've had you on here for an hour and 36 minutes. Time flies when you're having fun, sir. Any final thoughts for the listeners of today's show?
As I said to you during the pre-show call, Rich, I would really urge and encourage interested Americans and open-minded people to please read about it and talk about what is going on in South Africa. I'm putting myself out there appearing on a show like this, and I do it for the simple reason of raising awareness. I don't believe that our ruling party and our president and our former presidents are being held sufficiently to account by foreign countries and foreign governments. And I think we as South Africans can do better. And how do we do better? I think we could do better by being much smarter when we come to the ballot box, but also by trying to encourage indirect pressure to be applied to our current politicians who would go on a world tour and say everything's hunky-dory in South Africa and we have no crime and no unemployment and it's the land of milk and honey. I think we can turn it around, but as I said earlier, we're at a watershed and we need to do it from now. So the dithering and the double talking and the forewarnings that the instigators of this civil insurrection / attempted coup, they need to be brought to book. If I was in law enforcement, by that I mean you arrest them the next day, not a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, 2 months later.
Yeah, and you and I talked about this yesterday. It does take a lot of courage to do what you're doing, Neil. And I tell you, it's one of those things that when I look back, I can at least say, I had people like Neil on here. We discussed it openly and reasonably, without passion or prejudice. We had these conversations, I think, in a very respectful way. And I hope people are paying attention. Linda says the most fascinating interview. We'll watch again and make notes. Mr. Rob Pincus says great conversation, gentlemen. And Rob, we need to get you back on here again. I'd love to have you back on, my friend. Neil, thank you for coming on the show today, sir.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Rich.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Folks, remember, if you want to check out any of the links to any of our today's sponsors, you can find those in the show notes. Find the link to the article that Neil referenced several times in today's show notes. Tony says, great show, Rich. I hope you're bright as well. My wife just had surgery. Thank you so much, Tony. Jeremiah says, thanks, gents. Great show. Alan says, Mr. Taylor, stay in the fight. Godspeed to you and your country. Great show. Folks, remember, the fight is coming. Be ready.